Hello, this is the Growth League podcast. My name is Caleb Clark, and my mission for this show is pretty simple. It's to learn from marketers on how they're playing the great game of marketing leadership, their ideas, experiences, perspective, wins and losses, and the playbook that they've established over time. Listen, there's more than one way to lead a marketing team and a marketing function. So if you're a VP, a CMO, director, or someone aspiring to fill one of these marketing leadership roles in the future, tune in to learn from some of the best in the business.
I try to think about feedback in the sense of the feedback I'm giving quarterly or annually, in my opinion, should be around how do I help this person grow their career? If there's tough feedback that needs to happen, I'm not going to wait until the quarterly review or the annual review. I want to be having that conversation sooner and try as best as I can to apply that radical candor feedback to make sure the person knows that I do care and that this feedback is being given in that person's best interest. And then making sure though that they do understand, and that's the challenge directly aspect, that this is something that needs to be different for whatever reason that is.
Welcome. My guest today is Garrett Genest, the Director of Growth at Kudos. I appreciate you being on the show. Good to have you here.
Yeah, thank you, Caleb. It's good to be here. Excited to chat with you.
Give us a bit of an understanding of your journey as a marketing leader and what ultimately brought you to Kudos today. What drew you to that, whether it be the mission, the cause, the promise that you offer to the market. So a little bit about your journey as a marketing leader, and what brought you to Kudos.
Yeah, for sure. So I've always, since the start of my career, been working in tech companies of various kinds. I started out at a company here in Calgary called Blackline Safety, which kind of combined software and a hardware aspect to it. And from there, I moved to a manufacturing company out in BC, which did power distribution, power backup equipment. So I've always loved and I've always been passionate about technology and about marketing, technology marketing, and kind of the sales process behind that. And back in, I guess, 2018, we were looking to come back from BC back to Calgary because this is where home is,
right?
And saw this opportunity to come work at Kudos and join a brand new marketing team. And the promise of the company was really exciting. It's a company that is all about making the world of work better for people, for employees. And so I really just found that purpose and that vision resonated with me. So took the leap and moved back here to Calgary and joined the company and have been with Kudos ever since. And it's definitely been a wild ride. The company has grown and changed a lot over the 5 years that I've been with it, 5+ years. And the market has also changed a lot too. So it's, it's just become a lot more competitive, and there's also a lot more interest in what we offer. So 5 years ago, I guess almost 6 years ago, there were a lot of companies that knew and understood the value of employee recognition. But when we hit the pandemic, in particular, businesses started to realize that, hey, we really need to figure out a way to engage and to connect our employees. Everyone was going remote at that time. Businesses that maybe had never even had or even thought about hybrid work models were suddenly going 100% remote. And there were things like disparities in face-to-face time, communication, things like that. So the amount of interest significantly increased. And at the same time, the pandemic drove an acceleration in the amount of disengagement that employees worldwide were facing. So it was a lot harder to keep employees engaged. And then we started to hit the Great Resignation, where people were leaving companies in droves. And we saw what were considered healthy employee turnover rates in businesses go from like 10 to 15% up to 30%, 40%, 50%. People were just having a lot more trouble businesses were having a lot more trouble keeping their people on the team. And it was very easy to find a new job that might be paying you 50% more, might be paying you double what you were earning. Right. And businesses needed to find ways that they could help retain these employees without massively inflating their payroll costs.
Right.
So that's where interest in things like employee recognition software, employee reward software, and other types of platforms designed to help with engagement started to really pick up from kind of my experience with seeing how things have accelerated.
Right. And so that would have been kind of in the middle of your tenure with Kudos, right? That all these radical changes were happening, which shifted obviously the way you do things, the way you position the offering. But before you came to Kudos, it was part of the allure for you closer to the fact that you had been missing this type of thing in previous workplaces or cultures, or is it something that was apparent, but just was an area of passion for you that ultimately brought you? Was it missing in your previous experiences, or was it there and you wanted more of it?
So I think it was two things. I really built my career off of both technology, so kind of an aspect of marketing operations, and demand generation.
Right.
So I always was interested in that. And Kudos presented an opportunity to come into kind of a greenfield scenario. We had a CRM, we had Salesforce, we had a bunch of other tools, but they hadn't really been leveraged to their full extent. And there weren't a lot of sort of bad habits or things that had kind of been established that you walk into when you go into a more established, say, a 40-year-old company,
Right.
right? There was a sales team that was very progressive, high energy, very open to new things. And so it was a combination of the opportunity to do what I already was very passionate about doing, but in a greenfield sort of
Right.
scenario where you could essentially take anything and say, let's try this, let's see if this works, and not have to worry about, well, can't do
Right.
that because our sales team doesn't like these things, or can't do this because we don't have the software for that. It was absolutely wide open.
That's
And that
nice.
was really exciting for me at that time. So,
Yeah.
yeah,
The opportunity to you put your thumbprint all over it, right? And kind of your teams as well. I think that's something that a lot of marketing leaders crave, is the ability to have that blank slate, so to speak. That's
yeah.
cool. So for you now, as a marketing leader, what is maybe one thing that comes to mind that sort of keeps you up at night a little bit, or creates challenge for you and your team, that are not related to sort of macroeconomic or societal things, but more within the function of the way you play the game on a day-to-day basis?
Hmm. I would say, I think this is probably something that anyone who is in leadership, especially people who are really mindful about how their people are feeling, probably gets kept up at night on. But it's just is when you think about what are the things that your team members worry about on a day-to-day basis, right? Or what your team members are feeling, what things like, even you said not to think about macroeconomic, but macroeconomic circumstances, for instance, can weigh on team members.
Totally.
And no matter how effective you are at establishing radical candor with your team members, doing your best to make sure that your team members feel like they can be open and honest with you, everybody is different. And you'll have team members who are going to be super open and super vulnerable, which is amazing because you know exactly what they're worried about. You can address those things. But you'll also have people who maybe through their career, they've become conditioned to think, I can't share vulnerability because that's a career limiting move or it's a career threatening move, right? And so you never can know 100% of the time if what you're getting from a person is actually their truly being vulnerable, and maybe they're just, yeah, feeling like everything is good, or if they're holding back on that. And for me personally, I would say that's something that keeps me up at night a little bit,
Yeah.
from time to time, where you don't know, are you truly getting all the feedback from your team members that you need to be getting, or is something getting held back? And at the end of the day, all you can really do is do your best,
Yeah.
but it's one of those things where at the end, a year down the road, you'll know, because if someone was holding back and they just did not share and you weren't able to crack that nut and get them to be vulnerable with you,
Yeah.
and if they're not feeling like they're able to bring their whole self to work, or they're not feeling like the circumstances that they're in are the circumstances they want to be in, they'll probably show you by going somewhere else or by becoming actively disengaged, and you can kind of tell.
That's really interesting. I want to break that down a bit, and going back to your first point about what personally challenges you. I think just the fact that you're even sharing that as a challenge automatically tells me a lot about you as a leader and the way you approach leadership. I mean, you have to understand, and I'm sure you do, that there's a tremendous amount of leaders out there that aren't giving any thought to that. It's about what are our KPIs? What's the marketing system and the activities we have in place to hit those? And, leave your stuff at home, type thing. And I think that the fact that burdens you, again, says a lot about you as a leader. So want to commend you on that first and foremost. But on that topic as well, if it does burden you, what have you developed or relied on as ways to quiet those fears and actually, do something about not keeping you up at night based on that?
Yeah, I'd say the number one thing that's kind of like a cheat code for anybody is vulnerability. So
Right.
if you want someone to be vulnerable and if you want someone to trust you, you kind of have to start doing that yourself. And so
Right.
often, like for instance, when I'm doing career planning discussions with my team members, one of the questions that I like to ask, and it's about two-thirds of the way through the process, but one of the questions I ask is, what is it about your career progression that frightens you or worries you, right? Like career progression, to some extent, it's a known, like you have an idea probably of where you want to go, but you don't necessarily understand or know all the nuances of what that might look like, right?
Right.
And so I like to ask that question because it one gives an opportunity for people to also be vulnerable. But typically what I'll do is I'll be vulnerable first. And I take vulnerability beyond just that one
Right.
session that I run with my team. But generally, if you have uncertainty about things, or even if you just don't know the answer to things, being super upfront about that and just saying, maybe something might take me time, right? I'm not going to be able to finish this for the team. Let's say it's
Right.
like a policy or something like that, right? Like I'm not going to be able to finish this tomorrow, and maybe I don't even have all the information. Being vulnerable about those things,
Yeah.
I find helps a lot. It doesn't get you all the way there to that reciprocity and getting your team members to be vulnerable,
Right.
but it helps a lot because the evidence for me that I have of that is when I've had movement of team members where maybe new people are reporting to me or reporting to the people who report to me, and I do skip levels or one-on-ones, seeing that right off the bat from the very first session, there is a degree of vulnerability already
Right.
when maybe we haven't really had the chance to have one-on-one discussions to establish that level of trust yet.
Right.
The fact that there already is some degree of trust and willingness to be vulnerable, to me, says that that is at least going in the right direction, that being
Right.
vulnerable broadly and like as bravely as you can be, just be vulnerable all the time, does seem to help set that standard that people can share with you.
Yeah. Now, are these discussions that happen in advance of getting into the work of the marketing work, or is it something that you found a way to sort of intertwine into the day to day? We're talking about projects and KPIs and execution and tactics, but we're also uh, career planning together, being vulnerable, making a safe environment. Is it woven in? Does it have to be? What's been it for you?
I like to weave it in because it can be challenging, especially let's say you joined a new team. That could present an opportunity to say, okay, let's level set, let's do these sessions, let's talk, let's figure out what is our baseline here, what does
Right.
everyone want out of their career. That presents a good opportunity. But my experience, at least at Kudos, has been that it's been more of an organic evolution over time. Our team has grown over time,
Right.
and roles and things that people are interested in change over time. Career aspirations can change over time.
Yeah.
And so just doing it at the very beginning is okay. There's nothing wrong with it at all, but you need to do it periodically. At least that's my experience. Is doing it periodically, you will find that there will be people whose career aspirations do change.
Yeah.
And when you do that, it also helps kind of keep it fresh so that let's say you come to understand that someone's career aspiration is not to become a VP of marketing one day. Maybe it's that they just want to someday start their own business
Right.
and that's what their career aspirations are. That really helps you to understand what kind of challenges should I put in front of this person, right? Maybe that person doesn't want to become that VP of marketing one day because they don't really want to lead people. Well,
Right.
maybe you don't need to be giving them the exercises and stretching them in that direction. Maybe it's more beneficial to be stretching them in the direction that helps them to get those skills so that they can then start their own business one day, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
understanding those things but also making sure that you keep a pulse on them because they do change. They can change as quickly as 2 weeks. I mean, probably even one day after you do
Yeah,
one of those sessions,
totally.
right? But yeah, it has to be. I mean, it doesn't have to be, but I believe it should be relatively frequently, like once a
Right.
year sort of thing. Yeah.
Why do you believe that so many marketing leaders shy away from conversations about career planning? Because I get the sense that that's not a topic that is readily discussed.
I don't know if I mean you might have a statistic. I've never even looked it up to
Yeah,
see what percentage or anything of marketing leaders might or might not dive in on career planning discussions or anything like that. I think my own experience is like a lot of things in leadership, it's very easy to just put it off and forget about it.
right,
And I think it just takes really being mindful to say this is important and to also realize that it can actually help your day to day and week to week, month to month work with your team members to understand these
I was gonna
things.
ask you about that. How does career planning elevate not only culture but actual impact or effectiveness of their role, of their task?
Yeah. Well, I think it comes down to engagement as well. Like if you have an engaged employee, you know that employee is going to probably give a lot more discretionary effort. They're potentially going to make decisions that are better for the company because they're just going to be more invested in that company. And my own experience just doing this since being at Kudos is that you don't necessarily, especially if you're a smaller organization, have the opportunity to give everybody a promotion every year, right? You have to weigh how you engage employees and how you grow someone's career with what the company can actually manage and what's actually feasible. And there's other ways to grow a person and grow their career and their career outlook besides just giving them a new title. By being able to identify opportunities to put people in front of new challenges and new things to help them grow those skills without necessarily saying, okay, cool, now you're a director, now you're a VP, anything like that, but saying, someday you want to be a VP. Let's put you in front of the company and have you presenting more because that's a skill that you're going to need to be doing. Person B wants to start their own business. Maybe it's a consulting company for Salesforce someday, right? Great. Let's figure out what opportunities we have to actually get you doing more project management around our marketing tech stack because
Yeah,
you're going to need those skills someday when you start your own company. And you can identify those things. And what ends up happening, at least in my experience, has been people really appreciate that. People do appreciate being given opportunities when they know that you're giving them those opportunities because you want to help them build those skills to grow their career. Where people don't get engaged is when there is no discussion around
right,
career growth. There is no discussion around how do we get you to that next step. It
right.
it essentially at that point is kind of like there's no benefit, there's no negative either. But if you're actually having those discussions, presenting those opportunities, you are balancing the scale in the right direction towards engaging those employees, helping them grow, and then hopefully keeping them around for longer.
That's awesome. Yeah. You invest in them and invest back into the organization because it's one stop on their journey, right? It might be a long stop, might be a short one, but I think that's great. Now for you, when you're talking about things like building culture and recognition loops and career path planning, how do you balance that with sometimes as a marketing leader, you have to have very tough and direct performance oriented conversations. How do you create a balance? And what's your playbook on that?
I really like the Radical Candor framework. It's a book written by, I can't remember the second author's name, but I know the first one's name is Kim Scott.
Yeah,
And really good book, really good framework. And I find it a really just simple way to understand the idea of making sure that you're challenging directly, but also caring personally.
hmm.
And so that's something that I always try to keep in mind when I'm thinking about how to give feedback. And then the other thing that I do as well is when we do our quarterly assessments or annual assessments, I try to think about feedback in the sense of the feedback I'm giving quarterly or annually in my opinion, should be around how do I help this person grow their career?
Hmm.
If there's tough feedback that needs to happen, I'm not going to wait until the quarterly review or the annual review. I want to be having that conversation sooner and try as best as I can to apply that radical candor feedback to make sure the person knows that I do care and that this feedback is being given in that person's best interest. And then making sure, though, that they do understand, and that's the challenge directly aspect, that this is something that needs to be different for whatever reason that is. And I think another piece, I've believed this since even before I started my marketing and career, just for or my career in marketing,
Yeah.
I can't speak,
Mhm.
is that if you really focus on your hiring and making sure that you are hiring people who are really well aligned with your culture, with your company's vision, and just with even your vision for your team, it does minimize the number of times that you need to be having those conversations.
Right.
And so if you pick the right people, if you've been empowering them and just coaching them, ideally you're not ending up in too many situations where you need to be having true quote
Right.
unquote hard discussions. It
Right.
will come up from time to time, it's inevitable, but not once a month sort of things, right?
Right.
It might be once every 2 years, once every 3 years.
Yeah. And I can see with the framework that you've just described here that I don't imagine feedback is a surprise to members on your team very often. Is that true, or does it feel like things come out of left field to them?
I would say that you're correct. So my belief is that when you're doing quarterly or annual reviews, at least the way I do it, is I don't hit submit in our system and just say, cool, they'll see it when they open it,
Right.
right?
Right. Right.
I like to actually tie that into one of our one-on-one calls and just go through it with them because it gives the opportunity to talk about it. And if there's anything that they think is not fair or anything that they might add to it, it presents the opportunity to do that in those calls.
Right.
I don't think I've ever once had someone say that the feedback was unfair, but I have had times where people actually added additional things to it. So, like
Interesting.
in the what could a person do to improve field, they would actually volunteer one or two other things. It doesn't happen often, but it
Yeah.
does happen from time to time where it becomes a bit more collaborative to talk through these things.
Right.
And I find that probably half the time, not all the time, it also depends on the person and the person's sort of personality, that often people will say, thank you, I really appreciate this feedback. And it's nice because they view it as more of, hey, I'm interested in your career. I want to help you grow. These are the things that I think will help you move forward in your career, rather than being me waving a stick and being angry, right?
Right. Right.
It
Right.
shouldn't feel like that ever, even if you're having a hard conversation. So
Right. No, that's
yeah.
great. So for other marketing leaders that are listening to this and share your philosophy or your ethos on this, um, what features of Kudos support or align this philosophy and kind of amplify its ability to be put into reality?
Very interesting because you might think that, oh, yeah, I'm recognizing everybody more or less equally. But if you actually look at the numbers, you might realize that there's someone who maybe you've only recognized once in the last 3 months and another person you recognized 3 times in the last week or last month. And so
Hmm.
figuring out, okay, maybe I'm not actually paying enough attention to what this person is doing and being a bit more mindful about actually looking at what is this person doing so I can recognize it. So
Right.
now what I do using that dashboard, I keep a little notepad, and every week as things come up through the week, I make a little note for myself of recognition to send. And then at the end of the week, I'll just do kind of I go through and I send recognition messages to people on the team to make sure that they are recognized for the things that they do. And it's key to make it really meaningful. It shouldn't just be, hey, thanks for being you,
Yeah.
or thanks
Yeah.
for all the work that you do. That's great. But actually being specific about what it is that you're recognizing the person for, recognizing the effort that they're making, and then also tying it back to why is this actually important? What is
Mhm.
the impact of this on the business, on people, on customers, whatever that
So you mentioned a couple things like specificity and why this particular piece of recognition matters in the overall grand scheme of what we're doing as a business. And you talked about being conscious of balance across your team and making sure people don't get left out. But for marketing leaders that are keen on adopting a more intentional recognition practice amongst their own function and through their own leadership. What are some of the common mistakes you see or things that are overlooked as it relates to doing recognition well?
I think a couple things that I mentioned. One is just not, well, like you said, not being specific. So just the
Right.
thank you for being you. That's a super common message that I've seen throughout my career that people will send when they're just saying, let's say on Slack, they just send a message to a team member, thanks for being you.
Right.
Doesn't
And in
really
their in
have,
their mind, they checked off the box of, okay, I recognize so and so, right?
yeah, exactly. And it's nice to hear that because at least a person is saying, "Hey, I really appreciate you," but you're not recognizing specific behavior.
Okay.
And the behaviors that you recognize are the behaviors that you're going to see more of.
Right.
And that's why it's important to recognize effort because you want people to be putting in effort. If you only recognize the outcome, then you may see more of that effort, but you might also be potentially going down the path of seeing behavior that you maybe don't want to see, right? Like
Right.
you want your team members to actually be putting in that effort and putting in that care, not just hyper focus only on the result. That, depending on who you talk to, can potentially be a bit of a contentious topic. People argue about this, like you should be recognizing results because you want the results. You
Right.
should be recognizing behavior because you want to see the behavior. I think you want to be recognizing the behavior that gets the result that
Right.
you want.
Right.
And I think that's a key piece that I even find myself sometimes making that mistake where someone does something and then there's a great result and my recognition message is immediately, wow, great work on closing that deal. That's a huge deal. Yes, but what about all the work that actually went into
Ah,
closing that deal? That's what I should be recognizing
okay.
because you want them to
So
be doing that work.
if there is an outcome that you want to celebrate, could it, but you want to, kind of be doing it in the way that you're describing, could it be something like, hey, Sarah, for all of you that don't know, this was the outcome, amazing. But more importantly than that, what I want to recognize is, and then whether some of those building blocks or activities that happened beforehand, behaviors that happened before, is that an example?
Yeah, that totally could be. Or the way I often will do it is let's say it is a deal closing.
Yeah,
The message might be, hey, exceptional work closing that deal. I know that you had to put in so many hours, and this client had some really specific expectations that you had to go digging and find information for. And I know there were a couple of false starts, but you didn't let it drop.
right,
That would just be how I would do it to let it flow. But yeah, the idea is the same. It's yes, there is an outcome, and that outcome is probably what's triggering you to think of sending the recognition. But you're definitely going to be tying that back to what was the work the person did.
right. That's awesome. Well, thank you very much. I mean, it's just such a great example of how leadership can look within a function. Based on recognition, career planning, and just a creation of safety, so that the best versions of team members can come out. I think it's not a topic talked about enough, and I really want to thank you for sharing your playbook on it.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Happy to help and share the information. I think the more that leaders can lean into recognizing their team members and just giving them that psychological safety, you kind of touched on that there with your words, but
Yeah.
the more that folks can tie into that, then businesses will start to see that they do end up having voluntary turnover numbers that might be ticking downwards and might see circumstances like for us where we had no voluntary turnover when other businesses were in the marketing team, when
Yeah.
other businesses were seeing 50% voluntary turnover, right? So those kinds of things really create unique competitive advantages for businesses because they're not having to spend hundreds of thousands or potentially millions of dollars extra in recruiting talent that's
Yeah.
left, so
Well,
yeah.
that's actually a great. I think that a lot of people forget about the significant cost associated with
Oh
turnover,
yeah.
retraining, retention, all these types of things. So,
It's nuts. Yeah.
one way to generate profitability growth is not just sell more stuff; it's to you know uh, escape those costs that could have otherwise been eliminated through playing the game in ways similar to as you're describing. So that's great, man.
Yeah. Yeah. Very true.
Everyone, my guest, Garrett Genest, thank you so much. And what's next for Kudos? When you close your eyes 5 years from now, like what is the trajectory of the brand of the organization? What comes into clarity for you?
Just keeping things going, just grow this business and make the world of work better for more and more people and workers just across the globe. So just onward and upward.
Awesome. Thanks so much,
Yeah.
Garrett. Appreciate it, man.
Yeah. Thank you very much for having me.